Hi, good evening. My name is Sofia Lemos. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Riga International Biennial of Contemporary Art, whose title this edition is "And Suddenly It All Blossoms." It is curated by Rebecca Lamarche-Waddell, and it is my great pleasure to be with you this evening to welcome you to the second convergence of our online series of talks and conversations, which is focusing on nature. So this evening I have the privilege of welcoming the California and New York-based anthropologist Tobias Rees, whose profound curiosity for the worlds and the conditions of possibility on which our existence is contingent on has made him one of the most expensive, disruptive, and always generous thinkers of today. Tobias has pursued degrees in different fields such as neuroscience, art history, anthropologists, and all different perspectives coming at a larger question, which is really an overriding concern: what is the human? As part of his long-standing inquiry, our talk today sets out not to give a definition of either the human or nature, but really understanding how the human emerges as a figure separate from nature, which is our glossary word this week, but also how it emerges separately from animal, mineral, vegetal, and machine ecologies. Tobias Rees is the Reid Hoffman Professor of Humanities at the New York School for Social Research. He's the director of the LA-based Berggruen Institute. He's a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Incredible curriculum, and his expertise lies at the intersection of art history, at the history of science, at the philosophy of modernity, and his work is concerned with how categories that order knowledge mutate over time. What are the effects of these mutations? And what are the effects that these mutations have on the human and on the real? Tobias is also the author of Designs for an Anthropology of the Contemporary, Plastic Reason, and more recently, After Igno. So, Tobias, it's really our pleasure to welcome you this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor. Although I'm a little nervous because what I'm presenting are really tentative research findings on the history of the concept of nature. The background to my talk is really provided by writings that were published over the last 20 years or so, and that all focused on the need to move beyond the human, or beyond modernity, understood as the age of man, in quotation marks. Most of these writings, my references to Latour, Haraway, or Graham Hartman, Timothy Morton, Anat Singh, Elizabeth Povinelli, Eduardo Kohn, and so on. Most of these authors, or most of these texts, try to overcome the human in terms of nature, understood as a cosmos, as a kind of ontological ground of all being. Now, what actually for these authors is nature? So if you read through them, you come up, just looking at what do they talk about when they talk about nature, you come up with a list of things, and it's the ecosphere, mushrooms or mycelia, trees, birds, microbes, the ozone layer, insects, dogs, forests, earth, water, waterways, pebbles, the climate, and so on. The way that they use the word nature suggests that nature is made up of things that have a physical, material reality. I call it matter. That's very important for the talk. And these are things that somehow exist on their own terms, which I mean, they are not made by humans. They are independent and in that sense out there, outside of the human sphere, that are other than technology or the artificial. So nature in most of these texts is an ontological order made up of non-human things, matter out there. It's also important that for most of these authors, nature has some form of ontological primacy. It's something that is older than humans, that precedes humans, that is sort of original, that is somehow true or truer. So overcoming the human usually means reinserting the human in the ontological order of nature. And where this happens, we have a cosmos, with the consequence that the cosmos is nature as the non-human plus humans in it, roughly. So in my own research, I'm also interested in moving beyond the human, but I find myself hesitating And the reason for this hesitation is what I think of as a conceptual inclination that requires me to look at nature not as a given, nature as this ontological order as which it figures in most of these writings. So I cannot look at nature as a given, I look at nature as a concept. If you look at nature as a given, as a true ontological category, and you have to overcome the human, then that means that you operate in the genre of truth. You operate in the genre of a correction of an error. If nature is true and the human is not, then you have to correct that. There is also almost inevitably a moral dimension to overcoming the human in the name of an ontological truth. So what I'm proposing, or what I find myself compelled to do, is what I would call a shift in the genre of research from ontology to conceptual inquiry. So I'm asking, where did the concept of nature that Latour and Haraway and Singh, etc., operate with, where did this concept of nature come from? When was it first articulated? Why then? What understandings of the world existed before this concept of nature was around? Was there maybe a time when nature was not known, when that simply didn't exist as a category? And I'm curious, how did the emergence of nature as an ontological order, how did that change, reshape the experience of the world, the structure of the world, the structure of self and not self? So when did this concept of nature as an ontological order actually first emerge? I think that it didn't exist, or it doesn't predate the early 17th century. That is maybe a weird claim, a funny claim, because we tend to think that nature is, of course, that thing that has always been there, is the origin of all things. But I'm really focused on the idea of the concept of nature as the origin of things. When did that emerge? So I say only in the 17th century. To make sense of that, one has to go back in time. And so the main reference I want to focus on is Aristotle, specifically his physics, because Aristotle's physics kind of defined for more than 1,000 years what nature was, at least in the European context, of course. And so in chapter 1, book 2 of the Physics, he writes, and this is a direct quote, and I will spend some time elaborating on that quote. He writes, "Some things exist or come into existence by nature, and some otherwise. Animals and their organs," and for Aristotle, humans are animals. They're special animals, but they're an animal. Animals and their organs, plants and the elementary substances such as earth, fire, air, water, these and their likes, we say, exist by nature. They have within themselves a principle of movement or change and rest. For nature is the principle and cause of being moved and being at rest to those things, and to those things only, in which it, nature, inheres. So if one breaks this down in a much more simple language, one finds that some things exist by nature. These things have within themselves a principle of movement. Nature is the principle and cause of being moved and being at rest. So if I just go by this passage, then we encounter a concept of nature that is totally, radically different from the one that our authors that we started with actually use. First, nature is for Aristotle not stuff. It is not matter. It is not a physically existing thing. It is not the non-human. Instead, nature is an immaterial first principle. He will often write that things have a nature. So that implies also that nature is not an ontological order. This first principle, this immaterial a nature, the nature of a thing, cannot be found in matter. It's immaterial. So the question is, well, how then, for Aristotle, was it possible to get to know nature? Well, clearly not by way of empirical research of the study of matter, of things out there, because that's not nature, right? So the answer is for him thinking, and there's a whole, one could go here into a long history about what thinking means for Aristotle, what deduction means for Aristotle. I think the important part that we need to know about this are two words, discrimination and analysis. He will always look at the thing, ask, how is this thing organized? What are the first principles from which a thing, the nature of a thing, unfolds? And he will focus on this. But much more important for my story is that the form of thinking that Aristotle refers to here is called noesis. And he takes this term noesis basically from Plato, who made a distinction between two kinds of thinking. One is called noesis and one is called dianoia. Dianoia is probably best translated as instrumental reason. It's something that artisans are concerned with. It's the sort of technical stuff that you need to know when you build something. Noesis is something that is very different. It comes from the term nous, which means being or there is. And the idea is that everything that exists, including the human thing, is organized by what Plato calls an eidos. That's a term that Aristotle frequently uses to call it often an idea or a form, or another word that Aristotle uses, a first principle. So this is an immaterial quality, first principle, or a nature. And this is what Aristotle and Plato associate with being or with nous. So noesis, the form of thinking that allows to know nature, is actually a thinking that participates in the nous, in the divine thought, if you will. So I summarize the section on Aristotle. Nature as an empirical domain set apart from humans didn't exist in antiquity. The term nature doesn't refer to physical things like trees or mushrooms or forests or dogs or insects, etc. Instead, the term nature refers to first principles. It's an immaterial concept. Nature is not one ontological domain among many other ontological domains. For nature, via the nous, is in some way all there is. Everything, including humans, has its nature. As nature is not matter, one cannot get to know it by way of empirical research. The study of nature or first principles is ultimately a metaphysical project. So jump to the next section, which is about the early 17th century. So I think that very little changed over time between Aristotle and the 17th century. Now, on the one hand, that's an unbelievably stupid and naive claim, because in 1,000 years of thinking, so much must have happened. But I think it's easy to see how, let's say, in the Middle Ages, the scholastics were primarily writing texts on Aristotle, comments and commentaries on Aristotle. And of course, they refined and they added and they changed. But I do think that the major structure of the concept of nature remained unchanged during this period. Nature remained an immaterial first principle that you got to know by way of what the Greeks call theoria, or what the Romans and the scholastics call contemplatio, sort of this metaphysical operation where you participate in the nous. So in the early 17th century, a major rupture occurs. And I think that an exemplary case for this rupture is Descartes' discourse on method, le discours de la méthode pour bien conduire sa raison et chercher la vérité dans les sciences, which was published anonymously in 1637. Now, I'm not saying that Descartes is the cause of this emergence of new nature. I'm just saying one can exemplarily see it in Descartes. And I have two sentences with which Descartes opens the discourse on method. The power of, so I'm quoting this, the power of judging well and of telling the true from the fails, which is what we properly call reason, is naturally equal in all humans. As for reason, it exists whole and complete in each of us. It is the only thing that makes us human and distinguishes us from animals. I hesitated with animals because the term is bête, donc les bêtes, which can mean animals, but simply means unreason, or people who, or the things that don't have this capacity to think and reason. So what Descartes begins with is a claim: humans have reason, and therefore they are set apart from animals, from the bat, who have no reason. Where does, like, how does he arrive at that claim? Where does this claim come from? And if one reads the whole book, then it turns out that the rest of the book is basically an explanation of how he arrives at that insight. Because this insight that humans have reason and hence can judge, which means think, evaluate, get to know, is the key claim of the philosophy that he presents. So I'm having a longer quote where he explains how he arrives at this first principle, that humans have reason. This first principle. So I'm reading this quote, which I sort of cut down to size so that it fits on a slide. I chose to suppose nothing. I rejected as unsound all the arguments. Lastly, I decided to pretend that everything that had ever entered my mind was no more true than the illusions of my dreams. This is very well known. Descartes basically begins to doubt everything. He goes on, I noticed that while I was trying in this way to think everything to be fails, it had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. And observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so firm and sure that not even the skeptics could shake it. I decided that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Then I looked carefully into what I was. Well, I could pretend that I had no body and that there was no world and no place for me to be in, I still couldn't pretend that I didn't exist. This taught me that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature is simply to think, and which doesn't need any place or depend on any material thing in order to exist. Accordingly, this me, this soul that makes me what I am, is entirely distinct from the body. This is a long quote in which I think three things happen. Three things that are really quintessential or fundamental for the history of the concept of nature. So thing one is, Descartes shows us how systematic doubting led him to the one critical insight, the first principle of his philosophy, he calls it, which is really a philosophy of knowledge. And that is, I think, therefore I'm existing. To some degree, he makes the human an epistemic principle. That is really quite something, because if you take authors like Aristotle or Plato serious, then they could never say, I think, therefore I am, i.e. they could not place or make being contingent on their own private thinking. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Things exist because there is a divine thought that brings them into being. So it's because things exist on the level of being that I can think. So it's more that being is the condition of possibility of thinking for the ancients, whereas Descartes simply declares, I think, therefore I am. So this is quite powerful. The second thing that happens is that Descartes here explains that what defines humans, what sets them apart, what sets the human apart from all other things, because only humans have reason, is reason. So that is what makes humans special. The third thing is that he says that reason, this immaterial thing, makes humans more than mere bodies, which implies that bodies, or the merely material, is without reason. In fact, shortly after the passage that I just quoted, he makes a distinction between an intellectual nature, this is a direct quote, intellectual nature, that is unique to humans, and a, quote, bodily nature that defines everything else, animals and plants, understood as the non-human. Now, what's interesting is that after this passage where he makes a distinction between intellectual nature and bodily nature, one being immaterial, the intellect, and one being material, bodies, he uses the term nature pretty much exclusively to refer to bodily nature. so that nature becomes animals and plants understood as the non-human, insofar as they have no reason, and as mere bodies. So they're reducible to bodies. And he's joined in this by most of his contemporaries. So, for example, Hobbes will instantly make a distinction between reason and nature and understand nature as the empirical field that must be studied in terms of the empirical sciences. There's Malebranche, there is Bacon, there's Boyle, etc. So it becomes a key principle in the 17th century. So the rupture with Aristotle or with Plato or the scholastics that Descartes stands for or amounts to couldn't be more pronounced. In fact, it's like a whole new world, one radically different from antiquity and the Middle Ages emerges from his work. Now, I make a couple of observations or offer a couple of observations. One, nature ceases to be immaterial, the realm of first principle. Nature now becomes composed of material things that are non-human. Two, the human is now exempt from nature. For the ancients, that was entirely absurd, right? In antiquity and the Middle Ages, everything had a nature. Humans too, they were just part of this. So it was implausible for them. Three, nature is now without reason. In fact, Descartes occasionally writes of mere nature, meaning things that are without reason. Again, for Aristotle and Plato or people in the Middle Ages, that's absurd because nature or the things that are for Descartes that for Descartes define nature, of course have reason. It's the divine thought that makes them what they are. So how could these things not have reason? But that's exactly the point that Descartes tries to make. So a major consequence of these shifts brought about in the early 17th century is that the way to gain knowledge of nature becomes radically different. Knowing nature, knowing the realm of the physical, required now to study the material makeup of matter, either in terms of geometry, as Descartes favored it, or in terms of empirical research, as people like Bacon or Boyle or Hobbes argued. Now, it's often implied when you read the history of philosophy, for example, or history of thought, or Collingwood's notes on nature, or something like that, that it's often implied that what happened in the 17th century is the discovery of nature, as if we sort of left the metaphysical or mythical age, where we sort of, where the metaphysical evaporated, and what was left was the purely physical matter. It's as if nature, the idea that is implicit in this is that nature had always been what it actually only became with Descartes, the world of physical things out there in the sense of not human. So many authors also suggest that what occurred was the beginning of the big divide or something like this. But I think that that's simply wrong. There is no continuity between the ancient concept of nature that Aristotle and his many commentators over the next 1,000 years relied on, and the modern concept of nature. The maybe most succinct ways of putting it is the ancients didn't live in Descartes' nature. So we see a rupture, we see the emergence of a radically new thing, a whole new organization of the world, of things, including the human thing in the world. This rupture marks the beginning of what is today often called human exceptionalism, modernity, or the age of man. It's the moment in time when humans become the only subject in a world composed of mere objects, when humans become the only thinking thing in a world of mere things, and humans become the only talking thing in a world of new things. Now, I think because of all my other research on the history of the human, that in fact the invention of nature that we see in the 17th century as a separate ontological order made up of physical material thing, that this invention of nature as the non-human was actually a key element in the invention of the human. So this idea that the human as such exists became possible by excluding the non-human and calling it nature. So jump to the next section. Within the subsequent century, the following story emerges. I have a slide here where you see this bottom line. underneath which is nature. So the idea is that at one point in time, humans were animals among animals. They were parts of nature. One moment in time, undefined, humans pop out of nature, and this whole new area, this separate realm, the realm of the human, call it culture, call it society, call it politics, opens up. The story that first is articulated in 1755 with Voltaire's Philosophie d'Histoire is that once humans leave nature, there is like a linear trajectory, call it history as progress, where we increase the distance, we humans increase the distance between nature and ourselves steadily. The consequence of this emergence of the philosophy of history is that nature now really becomes the out there, the place of origin, the place where we all come from that is other than technology, and that human reality is fully set apart. One of the most exemplary stories of this separation of humans from nature that the moderns tell is the history of landscape painting as it is usually told in the history of philosophy. And so you see here a typical painting from the Middle Ages where you have Maria and Jesus, and in the background you have this gold letter background, so no landscape. And it's interesting to note that in the Middle Ages and for much of antiquity, descriptions or paintings of landscape are extremely rare. So one of the earliest depictions of landscape emerges in the Arena Chapel, Giotto, in the 14th century. 13th, 14th century. And you see here the Exodus from Egypt with Maria and Jesus on the donkey. And it's one of the first sort of backgrounds. It's not yet organized in terms of a human perspective or a central perspective, but it's the first time that you see a painting that shows mountains and trees. If you fast forward about 200 years, then you see with Peter de Bruegel one of the first European paintings of nature that is almost devoid of humans. So it's really not about the human, it's about nature as an extended field. In the early 17th century, you then get the first juxtapositions of nature as the sort of, where you see the shepherds living with the animals and you see the city or the citadel on the other side. You see John Constable, this sort of romantic quality of nature as the place where everything is good, where we once came from. And you see, of course, with Caspar David Friedrich, the sort of the human on one side and nature on the other side, the mysterious, the place of origin again, the place that needs to be explored and known. The reason why I show this brief story is that the classical interpretation of the history of landscape painting is that for most of human history, humans were too close to nature, were too close to animals, to actually recognize nature as a set apart field. They couldn't appreciate the beauty of nature because they were still at the mercy of nature. But what happened over time was that thanks to technical innovation, we sort of mastered nature, became independent from it. And the first time that this really materialized was in the early modern age. Humans differentiated themselves from nature. Now they suddenly can turn around and say, oh, wow, this is where we came from. Look how beautiful it is. And they started to paint nature. So it's quite literally the canonical interpretation. However, from an Aristotelian perspective, nature was about first principles. It was nothing one could see or paint. That was not at all the point. So it's probably not that there was no landscape painting because humans hadn't differentiated themselves from nature, but because the concept of nature that moderns project on antiquity and the Middle Ages actually didn't exist in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The structural organization of the world into human and non-human things, into humans and nature, as different ontological categories was not known. The world, self and not self, was differently organized and experienced. So my claim in closing this talk is to suggest that most of the contemporary authors who wish to move beyond the human do so in terms of a nature that is part of the modern formation of the human. The consequence is that they ceaselessly reinscribe what they try to get away from, is the human. give a couple of examples. The first is we have never been modern. Now, this phrase, we have never been modern, could mean that the whole formation of modernity, including the invention of nature as this ontological order made up of physical, non-human things, is actually fake. It actually was wrong. We still live in an Aristotelian cosmos of first principles or something like that. But that's exactly not what we have never been modern is about. What is problematized instead is the differentiation of the human from the modern concept of nature as it only merges with Descartes. So you can see that we have never been modern is actually participating in the concept of modernity that defined modernity or the human. There's also in we have never been modern a strange longing for the divine, a certain nostalgia for the cosmos as a cure for the human. It's just that this cosmos is actually a modern fiction. It didn't exist in antiquity. You can also take the many ethnographers of the so-called ontological turn. What almost all of them presume is that the non-moderns, that is, those who supposedly never made the mistake to embrace modernity, and therefore never separated from nature, understood as this ontological order out there, have somehow preserved some original ontological truth that can serve as remedy to the modern, defined as the age of the human, set apart from nature. So again, you have a concept or reliance on a concept of nature that is in its historical origin entirely 17th century. It's actually, if you return to that schema, it's as if they were saying, yeah, but we moderns have moved so far away from nature that we have lost touch with it. But the non-moderns, those that still or live close to nature, that have never made this mistake of separating, they have sort of preserved some original wisdom or truth. So it's just a modernist inversion story, primitivism of sorts. Others, like Anat Singh, whose book on the mushroom is incredibly beautiful and captivating. So others look for the return of nature in the, quote, ruins of capitalist civilization. It's the subtitle of Anna's mushroom book. So it's as if the idea were that nature or life were kind of an ur-cosmic regenerative force that resets everything. So it's almost a classical romantic topic. The building falls apart, the trees grow back in. Usually it's a church that falls apart, and where the altar was, there is now a big tree. And so for Anna, it's the capitalist civilization that is in ruins, and life reemerges, nature reemerges, overgrows, etc. So it's again a modernist concept of nature. Then there is Donna Haraway, who steadily uses biology as a reservoir of metaphors for how to be human differently. I was thinking a long time about this because it's incredibly beautiful and works so well. But to some degree, Donna Haraway, or Anat Singh, whose path I really follow, so Donna is doing exactly that. She uses metaphor. A metaphor is usually means to take a concept from a field where it belongs, biology or nature, and moving it into a field in which it is alien or doesn't really belong. That's the metaphorical, call it the human. So to treat biology as a reservoir of metaphors for how to be human differently, interestingly, actually relies on that distinction between nature or biology as this field out there, the non-human, and the human. In fact, it is kind of interesting that biology or nature becomes sort of the true, i.e. the field from which one should learn how to be human. And the human is the problem or the thing that is set apart that is not nature. So even Donna Haraway is actually holding on to a concept of nature that I think only emerged with Descartes. So from the conceptual vantage I offer here, all of these approaches come into view as a classical modern enterprise, insofar as they all rely on, operate with, uphold as solution the modern concept of nature that first emerged in the 1630s. They all seem to operate, or they all seem to mistake, however indirectly, a recent concept of nature as an ontological timeless truth. consequence is that they steadily reinscribe what they wish to move away from, that is the human. So what's my alternative to all of this? Many, but one I would like to mention here, I call exposure. By exposure, I mean a form of experimental research that takes the conceptual formation or form human and literally exposes it to the world, to a given conceptual domain, to see what happens. I give one brief example, and that example are methane bubbles. Methane bubbles that were frozen in ice either for millions of years or in permafrost for a couple of thousand years, and that are now released due to human action, induced global warming. So when you look at these images, the methane bubbles are incredibly beautiful. The story of the world that emerges from these bubbles entirely ridicules the idea that nature is a steady place and that humans have history. There is a depth of time that shrinks the human to insignificance. The story of the world that is emerging from these methane bubbles is not a story about humans. It's a story of atmospheric events, of geochemical events, of changing temperatures, nor is it a story for humans. And in fact, it's a story that provides a non-human language, the language of geochemistry, that seems to be sufficient to think or talk about humans. So if one thinks about the human from the perspective of the world told by methane bubbles, then humans come into view as geochemistry among geochemistry. So what interests me would be what new, what unanticipated experimental possibilities for thinking about the world, for thinking about humans, about animals, about microbes, about geochemistry, about technology or politics emerged from these bubbles. What new or what unanticipated opportunities for being human after the human, after the modern formation of the human open up here? What new conceptions of nature? For me, thinking about this, it's as if these bubbles are an invitation to think the human in terms of the non-human, by which I mean an outside of the formation of the human, and outside even of the formation of the concept of nature that is part of the human. And what's at stake in this exposure is neither truth nor ontology, not my genre. At stake rather is the effort to provide experimental openings, opening up of conceptual possibilities of being human after the human, after all ontologies of the human or the non-human. And I think the key to this departure from ontology or from the formation of the human and its nature, its concept of nature, is to focus on the upholding of the purely conceptual. Another key is the insistence on the multiplication of these experimental efforts to open up. So for example, instead of methane bubbles, how about computers or deep learning networks or machine learning? How about SARS-CoV-2 viruses? The more escapes we find, the more experimental openings, the better. Now, chances are, or so I hope, that they do not add up into a consistent after the human. And that inconsistency, the fact that they don't add up, is actually a good one. It means that there is no dominant narrative or framework. So in the not adding up, that's where freedom resides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for this insightful, super in-depth journey into the modern concept of nature. I'm certain there's a lot more to unearth in the juxtaposition between classical antiquity and European modernity. But I was wondering, maybe we can start this sort of casually and with a simple question. And just now you referred to language and to the need for new vocabulary. So I'd like us to start with that. As you know, this series is built on a glossary that strives for polysemy, for multiple perspectives. And I was wondering how might language destabilize the everyday realities of syntax, structure, status, sentence stability.
There's, in English, a beautiful way of rendering Foucault's The Order of Things, or the description of the human that emerges around 1800 for him. And he calls it life, labor, language. So the human emerges at the intersection of three new sort of empirical fields, life, labor, and language. And indeed, if you look at the history of research about language, then there is something that is interesting, and that is that this capacity to speak, this capacity to invent meaning that doesn't exist in nature, this capacity to communicate, to, you know, to use language, to reason, to deliberate, to discuss, to agree, disagree, is in the period between roughly 1700 and 1900 discovered as a unique human property. Other things don't have that. So this quickly leads to a form of linguistic anthropological research where implicit in the language that one speaks is a whole understanding of the world. Now, I go one step back quickly, and that is, if you actually read 19th century books about the history of language, like how a language emerged in humans, then you see that the assumption that quote unquote primitive or aboriginal languages are actually animal sounds, and that it very gradually sort of progresses into full-blown human languages. And if a language has a very simple grammar and structure, then they're supposedly closer to nature, i.e. yet not very far progressed. But only the European languages really, and Sanskrit, of course, because that's where all Europeans come from, is sort of the full-blown language. People even wonder whether there is a certain structure or logic to Sanskrit which allowed the Europeans to eventually, you know, see the world as it really is, and all others being sort of, you know, enmeshed in another language. Unfortunately, never will get there. So step one would be to say, yes, humans have language, they communicate. But look at what else has language. So many things have language. Bacteria have language. All animals that we know have language, dogs, cats, birds, microbes. Computers have language. Computers communicate with one another, if you will. Radios communicate in one sense or another with one another. So the reason why I mention all of this is it now allows to take language as a human exclusive property and transform it into a series of things. Where you have bacterial language, where you have computer language, where you have bird language, where you have bees, where you have humans. So human language becomes one entry into a series of entries. It's nothing that is above or beyond, or it's not the human here and the rest there. And actually this series doesn't need to make a distinction between human and non-human or natural and artificial or something like this. It's really a fully integrated series. So just this operation of taking something that was uniquely human and transforming it into a series with the human as one entry opens up a whole new different understanding of the world, a different relation to the world, which I think is an important move. So the next thing is, or the second response is my search for a new vocabulary or something like that. That's incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult. I try to explain why. So a few months ago, I had a discussion with Richard Powers, the writer. It was about the Overstory, his book about trees. And the story actually began with a discussion about After Ethnos, where I say that my goal is to de-anthropologize anthropology so that you, as anthropologists, couldn't only study humans and human culture and human society and kinship systems and so on, but you could also study ginkgo trees or, you know, microbes or birds. And Richard basically said that his goal is to de-anthropologize the novel. And I was completely, you know, because the book's about trees, right? It's the overstory, the canopy, there's the understory and the overstory. And the overstory is also the overriding story of the humans. So humans find themselves in this tree world. So I thought that was entirely fascinating, because if you look at the importance of the novel for the emergence of the human, the novel is really the genre of the human. It's what provides the bourgeoisie, the rising bourgeoisie, with the language of interiority, of subjectivity. It's like the place where you learn to think about yourself qua human. It's where you enroll in what it is to be a subject that experiences, etc. So you could imagine that what we are facing now is a need of coming up with a new novel, with a new genre of novels, with this need of providing a whole new language of experiencing oneself, little exemplars that one must collect and assemble. Elvia Wilk is doing this, is trying to do this in some of her writing, or is beginning with it now, where one literally assembles little episodes that allow to think about oneself differently. So I give one or two really small examples. One is from my work about the coronavirus. There is an article that Frank McFarlane Burnett wrote in 1957 about smallpox, about a virus. It's very early. We barely know what a virus is. The first electron microscopy photos sort of just begin to appear. And he says, it's interesting, a virus is not an individual organism because it cannot exist on its own. In fact, viral life is borrowed life. And I really got intrigued by this idea of the borrowed life, because one could say, if you take the point of view of viruses or of microbes, that all life is always borrowed. No one knows where Sophia ends and her microbiome begins, right? There's an overlap in the middle. No organ system in your body can function without microbial metabolites. That means you're contingent. You borrow your life from your microbes, and your microbes borrow their life from you. You're not an individual organism, strictly speaking, nor are they. There is a form of overlap. So what would it mean to think about oneself, to experience oneself in everyday life, in like the smallest, most banal situations of every life, in terms of the borrowed life? Or another example is mind. So maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was first discovered that most neurotransmitters in our brain, or at least in a precursor form, are made by bacteria that live in our gut. So, the mind, this esprit becomes in the 18th century, this, the human defining things, only humans have mind. And in the 19th and 20th century, the mind becomes the most intimate thing, your mind, that's you. But here you have an incredibly moving observation. Your mind that defines you, that is most you, is actually contingent on not you, on bacteria. And I can push this further. So if the mental state you find yourself in depends on what neurotransmitters you have, then it's interesting that what neurotransmitters you have actually depend on what kind of bacterial populations you have, because different bacterial populations make different neurotransmitters, make different neural states. Now, what kind of bacterial populations you have actually depends on the food you eat. Different food breeds different populations. And to push this further, it actually depends on how the food that you eat was produced. For example, if you use synthetic nitrate, then the plants that you grow have no root microbiome, and hence they have no flavonoids or phenols, and hence the things that actually is so valuable health-wise for your bacteria is not there. So now you have mind, most intimate interior, and you have transformed mind into a series that goes from your brain to bacteria, to food, to agriculture. Is as if mind, internal, and agriculture, most external, become inseparable. That was my first obsession with Pierre Huyghe's exomind, the outside mind, is like, so how are you human in those terms, in terms of this series where mind is actually an external thing, where working on your mind could mean to do agriculture. So the more such stories and reflections and episodes we can tell, collect, make available, the higher the chances are that we can learn to experience ourselves differently. Shouldn't probably be too ambitious, because the first time we invented the human took sort of a couple of 100 years. So I think it would be silly to assume we do this in one afternoon.
And how do we articulate politics in this concatenation or series of events? What might happen when exposure becomes a political program, essentially?
So these conceptual researches I also can do with politics. So I can take the concept of politics as it emerges, in the early 17th century. Again, the classical reference is Hobbes. There you have a state of nature and you have a state of politics. And the state of nature is actually a state of passion. It's a state of war. It's a state of non-reason. And you have the state of politics, which is a state of reason. Now, one way of interpreting this is to actually say, this is silly. How could he do that? This dumb Hobbes. Oh my God, it's so mean to animals. But then there is an interesting observation where people in the social sciences defend humans against animalization, against the reduction of the human to biology or something like this. Why? So I remember Alain Badiou in the late 1990s scandalizing that's an animalization of the human, as if reducing us to these animals that don't have reason. Everything that matters is lost. So what's interesting is that this juxtaposition of the human, of the political, and of nature is incredibly powerful. And the idea, quite simply, is that in nature, animals don't deliberate about how they live together. Their form of living is not up for them to discuss. That's, or so the assumption is, a human exclusive matter. Only humans can deliberate about the form that living together should take. And this form of deliberation, this coming together around this deliberation, this we call politics. So it's a deeply ingrained ontological assumption for moderns. In antiquity or the Middle Ages, that cannot possibly be, because the form of living together is sort of predefined by the cosmos. Like the goal is to live in accordance with divine rules, so there is not much space for deliberation. So how to think about this differently? Well, you can take the concept of politics and expose it again, the microbiome field, if you will. And you find that from this perspective of the microbiome, the human as such, as set apart, doesn't exist, cannot possibly exist, because you do not exist without your microbes. And in fact, the kinds of molecular pathways and signaling pathways between microbial cells or prokaryotes and your cells or eukaryotic cells usually, predate you by a couple of 100 million years. So the human as such doesn't exist. In fact, it's as if you take a piece of the wild, you cut it out, you put it in a Petri dish, and you add bleach and antibiotics till almost nothing is left but a dead glibbery mass, and you say, wow, the human. But this human, the human of the human sciences, the faculties of arts, is from the perspective of the microbiome, a harmony of illusion. It's a pure abstraction. It has no reality. So now the challenge becomes, well, but how do you then think about the world? How do you think about the human from this perspective? How do you think about politics? And one would then have to articulate a politics, and that's really important. We make it this. So this is what I mean to say. This is a very critical point. So the goal is how to articulate a politics that is not about humans. It has to also be about humans. It's not for humans, but it also has to be for humans. But it is articulated from the perspective of how microbes over billions of years built the biosphere, of how they set the conditions of life for every single organism. So I cut short here. One would have to articulate only from the perspective of the microbiome, a politics from the perspective of what one could call the microbiocene. Now, is that a cosmos, in the sense that the form of discussion of living together, the form of politics, is not necessarily one of deliberation? No, not at all. It's not about divine laws. It's not about ontology. It's not about metaphysics. It's a pure conceptual invitation to think differently about the world. If I would take biogeochemistry, or if I would take icebergs, or if I would take methane bubbles, or machine learning, different conceptual openings would emerge. And we need many of those openings. We need them because it destabilizes any ontological truth claim. Again, the problem is the same as with how to be human. These new forms of politics must be articulated. They must be made visible in exemplary little stories that allow to imagine them. And these little stories in turn must be such that they become practicable.
Is this where contemporary art, or let's say more broadly, the artistic imaginary comes in? And perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the research program that you direct at the Berggruen Institute, the Transformations of the Human.
The Transformations of the Human program at the Berggruen Institute that I have the honor to direct has one simple idea. Everyone who wishes to leave behind, so the idea is to build a platform for everyone who experientially and existentially suffers from the formation of the human, including the concept of nature that is part of the human, and wishes to sort of imagine the world otherwise. Here is a platform, here are programs, please come and join us, think with us. And given that we don't think that the question of what comes after the formation of the human is an ontological question or a theoretical question, given that we think it's an experimental question, we conduct experiments, experimental research by inserting philosophers and artists in microbiome labs, in synthetic biology labs, in AI labs, to see what new concepts of human nature and technology, roughly, are emerging.
Okay, so returning to the idea of politics as the studies of, or as the study of forms of living together, I'd like us to maybe spend some time taking in and considering the concept of the human, particularly from the perspective of those who have been historically excluded from it and considered less than. So how do we, I guess my question would be, how do we reconcile more than human perspectives with anti-colonial, anti-fascist, anti-racist modes of living?
Would one tell the history of the concept of the human, also from a conceptual perspective, one could more easily basically talk about the problems of the category of the human. Now, here, it's really important to note a couple of things. One is that a general concept of the human, something that all humans share, it is in that sense truly universal and time and place independent. It doesn't matter when you're born, where you're born, the color of your skin, your gender, etc. Truly universal. Such a concept of the human has not always existed. It, for the majority of human history, has not been known. And the first time the idea emerges, it seems, is in Europe, which is a delicate thing to say, but it's in Europe in the 17th century. And the idea emerges in form of a question. What do all those people about whom we learn through all these travel reports, especially from North America, what do we all have in common? And the answer that European thinkers, again, the references to people like Descartes or Hobbes, the answer that they come up with is that what all humans have in common is that they're more than nature, animals and plants, and more than mere machines, more than the merely mechanical or something like this. Now, for them, that was an effort to be truly universal, to be time and place independent. And at least if one reads Descartes, in Hobbes there are lots of problematic passages, but not so much in Descartes about non-European humans. Anyhow, be that as it may, it's very clear that right away, from the start, this concept of the human with its two boundaries, machine and nature, were used to exclude some people from the category of the human. They were said to be actually nature and therefore not human, actually animal and therefore not human. This becomes really, really big in the 18th century with the invention of the philosophy of history, where one imagines the difference between nature and humans as a sort of historical progress trajectory, where people are judged according to how close they live to nature. And that becomes a playbook for colonialism. So there can simply be no doubt for anybody that the vast majority of humans has been excluded from the European category of the human, or from the category of the human, more accurately, that was invented in Europe in the 17th century. Now things get really, really complicated. So complication one is everyone who's fighting for radical equality somehow is indebted to the idea of a universal human. Now, complication two is I'm indebted to that idea. I fight for radical equality. And yet the form that the human was given, more than nature other than machine, is one I don't want to subscribe to. So I don't want to fight for the inclusion in a category that I know is actually rotten. It's kind of complicated, right? So now I have at the very least, I constantly must fight to render the idea of universality in the abstract visible, like relevant and impossible to ignore. And I must look for possibilities of actually articulating it that are non-ontological, i.e. that are not saying, and this is the truth. Hence my conceptual openings. Now, I do think that it's important to recall, to constantly remind oneself that what it means that the human is not a given, that it actually means that the concept of the human was a whole infrastructure of the world. It was a whole ontology. So to fight for the inclusion of some cultures in the human already implies that I subscribe to the category of the human as more than nature and other than machine. That's what the concept of culture does. To be a cultural anthropologist in the age of climate change and fight for non-European cultures means that I constantly reinscribe the crime I'm against. Humans are cultural things. I'm against climate change because I'm against the separation of humans from nature. Humans are cultural things. So this is like a constant yo-yo effect. And so I, in my observation, many of the people who have problematized the category of the human, many of the authors who have problematized the category of the human, who have done so absolutely rightly, also actually operate with that category of the human, i.e. their argument is contingent on it. Sylvia Wynter is a beautiful case for just that. And so because I share these goals, because I also suffer from the limits of the human, I'm looking for these alternatives, like, rethinking the novel with Richard, or doing works with Annika Yee or Agnieszka Courant or Pierre Hugues.
You initially suggested that some key figures and inspiring references for many of us working with or within the contemporary art field who narrate alternatives for living beyond the human try to do so in the terms of the modern concept of nature, right? So continuing in this way to reinscribe the human in the same frame. Could you expand a little bit on this?
I do think that what I said at the beginning of the talk is kind of correct. And that is that most people who try to overcome the human try to do so in the name of nature, usually imagined as some form of cosmos or some form of original ontological ground or baseline on which all things depend. Now, I also think that, at least I try to show that and make it compelling, that this concept of nature is not at all an ontological truth. It's a fairly recent category. So, like Anat Singh and Donna Haraway, who have in many important ways been mentors for me, I've known them for a long time. I'm eager in overcoming the human. And there's so many passages in the Mushroom book that are, that make you weep with joy because they're so beautiful and capture the possibility of a non-human form of living quite elegantly. Same for Donna Haraway. She and Bruno Latour, although I'm much more ambivalent about Latour, have opened up a realm of inquiry, of possibility that literally, 25 years ago, no one, like when the Species Companion Manifesto was published in 2003, people didn't know what to do with it. It was such a weird book. What is she talking about? This was really something novel, and I merely follow. But one thing that is very strong for me is call it the deontological drive, the idea of arguing in the name of truth, the idea of correcting an error, the idea of already knowing. So all of my research, as you read at the beginning, is focused on categories of thought and where they come from when they emerged. And if you do that kind of research, you recognize that you have to learn to operate in the space of the ignorant, in the space of what with Rilke one could call non-identity, this idea, one of his poems, that everything is not itself, as if things were not identical with themselves, right? As if there were sort of a little gap. And the reason why you have to inhabit this gap is that conceptual research makes you recognize that everything that you take for granted as a functional, everything that you take for granted as an ontological substantive domain, at one point in time wasn't known to exist. There were other ones that organized the world differently. And so how can you operate from that realm of the deontological, of that realm of non-identity?
Tobias, this is perhaps a fascinating thought for us to end on, uncertainty. And not only the way that you've been able to articulate how poetic invention allows for new categories of thought to emerge, but also how inhabiting the space of doubt and inhabiting or spending time with complex questions opens or might open the world anew. Do you want to sort of end with a last remark?
There are new categories at times emerging, new possibilities of thinking that you can articulate, like mycelia or the methane bubbles that I talked about, or COVID-19, if you will, or neural nets, synthetic biology. But the question is, do you present these new categories as a breakthrough to the truth? That we now figured it out? Oh, what we thought before was wrong. Silly us. Now we know better. Whew. But how often can you fool yourself? Like these breakthrough moments, we know exactly that they're just a conceptual opening, not an ontological opening. So even there, I'm looking at these conceptual openings as an opportunity to think differently that I do not subscribe to ontologically, which is why I have this argument of a shift in genre from ontology to conceptual inquiry, or from this conducting research because one wants to know how things really are, to conducting research in order to produce ignorance. So the why and to what ends one conducts research or inquiry is really, really important. And as I constantly want to fall on the side of ignorance, of the conceptual, of not knowing, of uncertainty, of making statements from the perspective of uncertainty rather than of certainty, nature is the good. Nature is the primary. Nature is the regenerative force that will reemerge from the ruins. I cannot do that. So I have to constantly be what most people experience as provocative and open up this impossibility of knowing. That's the form of my research takes.